So I'm just gonna probably, kind of continue from where Gautam left off. And also, I'll go back actually to the first question, which is about what are, according to us, pathways for energy transition. And I actually went back to, the first session, the political economy of energy transition, and I was trying to look for a couple of videos because I missed that session of the conference. And I think Dr. Vandana Shiva, in her mentions the need to deconstruct this vocabulary. And I think that's where we need to start, because when we are talking about energy transition, what it kind of, the impression that it gives is that it is about saving the planet. It initially kind of, the first impression is that this is neutral, but actually then there is this entire positive kind of vocabulary that is connected with it, of net zero emissions, of responding to urgently to climate change and the climate emergency, and then kind of also making it seem like it is a natural shift that is being driven by the current circumstances, and it's just a technology shift from one technology of producing energy, which is actually, I mean, if we kind of go into the semantics, then it is meaning electricity, but it is using the term energy. But if you look at what is part of energy transition and what energy transition is part of at the larger global level, it is shift to this green economy that the United Nations has been speaking about since we've been talking about it since Rio, but more after 2000, speaking about addressing climate change, where we are looking at energy also in terms of payment for ecosystem services. And what it actually is, I mean, one is what it hides, and what it actually is that it is a kind of, a lot of people at the critics at the global level have kind of talked about it as as climate capitalism, green capitalism. But what it actually is, yes, a way to keep the system, the neoliberal capital system, going at the global level, to keep that order alive. It is technocratic, not just technocentric. It is of course about technology, but it is also um, about control. It is about monetization of and financialization of what has also been left out of the market, which has not been brought under the market logic yet, the non-monetized resources, which is why we talked so much since 2000 about, and our courts and our, how the entire system is talking about payment for ecosystem services, financialization of these resources. It is about externalization of costs. It continues to be, because and I'll talk about that little when I'm talking about who is paying for this transition. And it is, most importantly, it is fraught with geopolitical implications. So this is not just about a particular country. It is about north south politics. It is about, I just recently heard a lecture on the geopolitics of energy transition by the director of John F. Kennedy School. The geopolitics of energy projects is the department that she's heading, and she speaks about the need for authoritarian, top-down measures by governments across the world to implement this energy transition. So it is also about, I mean, when we say top down, we also are looking at nationalistic or nation state based, kind of intervention. And we are also looking at what is happening with, China kind of trying to control this market, and what the US, how the US and Europe are responding, and Europe is supposed to be leading the way. So and the influence that all these countries are exercising in the climate negotiation. So the climate politics is, this is very much a part of that entire entire scenario. And what we are made to believe is that energy transition is equal to preservation or saving of the planet. And it is not just the military industrial complex that is working towards it, but I urge you all to also read a little bit about the non-profit industrial complex and the co-option or the capture of the climate movement by certain kind of large NGOs who are speaking the same language of energy transition and trying to continue to hide the reality behind it, whereas continue projecting it as the only solution to saving the planet. And I'll just wanted to read this quote, that in the green economy, the poor are promised environmental riches, recycled materials, and renewable energy can be exploited without environmental impact, and technology always finds a substitute for what runs out. All things can be made compatible by ignoring the basic contradiction between ever expanding human activity and a finite world. The illusion grows thinner every day, but in Rio, expect to see people wearing green tinted spectacles and waving smoked fish at each other. This is by an ecological economist. The article is Green Economy Red Herring. But just to kind of move forward and then talk about, so what is it that we are talking, are we saying that no, the planet does not need to be saved, or are we saying that we and human nature relationships are not in a crisis? Are we saying that there isn't ecological collapse happening if we reject the energy transition the way it is being kind of pushed? I would say no, because what we need, if we really want to address the issue of the ecological collapse and the breakdown of human nature relationships, especially because of the current neoliberal capital order, then we need a systems transformation and not an energy transition. And I would go back to, I mean, this is the all familiar the radical ecological democracy, Vikalp Sangam में इसकी बात होती रहती है. This question of what kind of transformation are we talking about? It has to be structural. It has to address the entire economic system, the entire model of ownership and distribution of wealth, income, and resources. It is about acknowledging and addressing issues that Bhargavi brought up of class, caste, gender, ethnicity, regional divides and disparities. It is about culture and knowledge systems, which includes both technology and education, by the way, because we tend to see culture in a very, kind of narrow way. So yes, it requires a kind of, on one hand, assertion of cultural identity, but on the other also, keeping in mind the justice and equity concerns. On the ecological front, we're talking about preserving and reviving the harmonious relationship between humans and the landscape. And most importantly, I think what we are talking about is a political transformation also, where we are saying that decentralized decision making and governance, which is based on principles of equity, justice, freedom, autonomy. We can go back to our constitution in the case of India. We can look at several cultural kind of references for this. But I think that the last question kind of will answer this more, so I don't want to get so much into detail. But about our role, I would just say that as a support group, we've chosen to kind of say environmental justice. We are looking at political ecology of human nature relationships in the Himalayas, and how these are being impacted by development, the current development paradigm, and the role of the state in pushing this, and how it is how it can be challenged. And one of the things to challenge the current kind of destructive development model is to kind of change the narrative also, which means that changing the narrative not just around what is development, but also kind of amplifying voices of communities who are trying to um, yeah, I mean, changing the narrative through amplifying voices of communities, through tracking and studying the impact of policy which is impacting the ecology, society, local economy. And we need to look at what is not just the development policy, but also conservation, but what government is pushing as clean energy. In the case of the Himalayan region, it's hydropower projects, and building democratic spaces, campaigning for people's ownership, for instance, through the use of the Forest Rights Act. That is one of the things that we've been doing for not just preservation of the landscape and the livelihoods that they depend on, but also making community the center of governance and decision making as far as the resources are concerned. So that is one of the things I wanted to say. Now, just coming quickly, and I'll just run through this in terms of the cost of what are the social and socio-economic, cultural, ecological costs of this transition. I'm just wanting you all to see this picture by Catherine Highland, which is from northern Chile, the Atacama Desert, rain shadow of the Andes Mountains. This is an area inhabited by indigenous communities, and this area has 7.5 million tons of lithium, which is the main kind of element used in production of batteries. And now with the push for this transition, especially for to electric cars, to solar, to large scale, and of course laptops, phones, everything uses lithium. And this is the picture of the SQM mine, which supplies lithium to Apple. And 1 ton of this was an interesting fact there. 1 ton of lithium requires 500,000 gallons of water for its production. This I've just given a link in this presentation. This needs to be looked at because in Latin America, like we had the example of Bolivia, also a couple of where the entire kind of politics is being determined by, and the way certain kind of authoritarian regimes are being preferred so that lithium mining can go on without any obstruction from the governments. Is just an example of the geopolitics that I was talking about earlier. In the case of the Himalayas, which I'm going to speak about briefly here, we have hydropower as being the kind of the key policy. Hydropower development is the key policy of this energy transition, though now it is more about solar and wind. As Shripad said, hydro is like in a bit of a tricky situation as far as its market prices, the economics is concerned. But still there is an attempt by the government, because this present government in 2019 made through a policy change, made projects above 25 megawatts also kind of under the category of renewable, brought them under the category of renewable, and now they'll be entitled to many more subsidies, obligatory power purchase agreements, etc. So there's a push for hydro. We've seen it with the Italian project and what is happening. And in the Himalayas, of course, from Jammu Kashmir to Arunachal Pradesh, there is a kind of plan for more than 290 dams, up to 150 lakh megawatt of electricity to be generated, and Himachal is leading in the production of that of hydropower with more than 10,000 megawatts already installed. And this is just a photograph from Kinnaur, which is a district in Himachal where a river has completely dried up because of a dam. This is earlier it was owned by JP, now it is Jindal's, the Baspa Dam. And just, trying to highlight here. Hello?
Sorry, Manshi, you'll have to hurry up, otherwise you're eating into your final question.
Yeah, okay, fine. So I'll just talk about quickly that, it's the riverine ecology and the impacts on the rivers have been adequately highlighted, but the land use change because of these projects is pretty massive. There's a direct impact of this land use change on forests, because more than 2/3 of the landscape in Himachal, for instance, is under the commons. The private agricultural land is only 10% of the geographical area. So you have the commons and the forests getting affected, and the forest dependent livelihoods getting affected because of the blasting and the tunneling. The spring water sources drying up, which this is just a kind of a chart that shows in one particular project the drying up of water sources. I'm not getting into it. Just to give you some images to know that there's a physical landscape change in an area, again this in an area that is already ecologically, geologically extremely fragile, that is seismically active, that is highly landslide prone. And this is just this chart gives an idea of the amount of forest diversion. Sorry, there's an error there. It's threats to the forest health, how forests and biodiversity are impacted. Majority of the forests diverted in Himachal Pradesh have been for transmission lines and hydroelectric projects since 1980. This is just to show that. And just to another map, just to show that the concentration of these projects is in areas which are already have been mapped as geologically vulnerable or fragile by the Geological Survey of India and the government. And this is where the concentration of projects is. So just kind of highlighting that again, apple orchards being impacted by landslides due to these projects. So if all the planned hydro projects in the Himalayas get constructed, it will be the most dam dense region in the world. And just to say, okay, who is going to pay for this transition? It is the communities who are dependent on livelihoods that are already energy sustainable in certain ways, whether it's pastoralism or it is forest dependent livelihoods. These are already kind of livelihoods that are not that don't have such a large footprint as compared to the urban and industry based livelihood. So we are talking about a shift because of a kind of a dispossession happening because of in the name of clean energy, dispossession of livelihoods that are actually sustainable or could be sustainable. So in the case of the Himalayas, you have the example of the water mills, which were already existing part of the production system. It's a technology also, but we never look at it as a technology because of the way it is kind of projected as rudimentary, primitive, etc. But these are already existing, and they have systematically been kind of finished and wiped out because of various reasons. So I think that it's very difficult to talk about alternatives in that sense, but I would say that the people's resistance to ecologically and socially destructive development and the entire kind of the economic model and people's movements for a more inclusive, just, democratic society are all part of the systems transformation that we are talking about. So I would say that the farmers movement that is happening today is a good example of the kind of pathway, I would say, towards a systems transformation, which could then open up possibilities of further discussion. The fact that the environmental movements have lent support, or the women's movement have lent support to the farmers struggle. The fact that the farmers struggle is not just about the farmers and their MSPs as it has been projected by some segments or most of the media, but the fact that it is about we are in a country where 86% of the farmers are small farmers or farmers with small land holdings. It is about land dependent communities. It is about food security, and therefore it's about consumers. It's about all of us. The fact that they have challenged the corporate powers like Ambani and Adani, and they're wanting to gain further control over food prices. I think that itself is kind of is part of this process of challenging the system, which is we know that is stepping away from protection of the rights of its citizens, which is stepping away from, which is compromising what is already promised in the constitution. So I think that that needs to be kind of kept at the center. And I'll just stress about the need for intersectionality and getting away or stepping away from specialization, because the discussion on energy transition is a specialized discussion, whereas its implications are social, economic, political. So how do we kind of not discuss it like it's a technical issue, which, because as even Shripad said, that if we need a robust, for instance, environmental governance system if we are going to implement this energy transition. So what we are actually saying is we need an robust environmental governance system if we need to protect our resources, our natural resources, if we need to protect nature, if we need to ensure intergenerational equity, if we need to ensure protection of livelihoods of forest dependent and farm dependent communities, etc. So I think that there's a need to kind of not fall into the trap of, I mean, I'm very skeptical about discussing the energy transition in isolation. I think that we need to look at more intersectionality, more solidarities between movements. We have examples like how the Forest Rights Act, for instance, has led to communities. We have the example of Mindalekha. There are plenty more, I think, that which are not being spoken about, may not have been documented in different parts of the country. And even as far as energy is concerned, we need to talk about decentralization and sovereignty. So I think that Gautam said, that social justice needs to be at the center of this process. I would say that if we are only talking about energy, I think we need to talk about sovereignty, the energy sovereignty as the key principle. If we are only kind of trying to look at energy systems, but of course we will have to look at equitable distribution and ownership and decentralization of production and ownership of resources. So I'll just stop there.